I want to say a special welcome to those that are joining us online this morning and those that are joining us on the radio at KTCU. We want you to know that wherever you are this morning, that you are a part of the worshiping community here at University Christian Church, and we could not be more glad that you have chosen to worship with us. So, in the Bible, we have 4 accounts of the life and the ministry of Jesus. We call them Gospels, a word that means quite literally good news. And each of those Gospels was written by a different person to a different audience, and therefore for a different purpose. And each one has its own subtleties, its own nuances. But one of the things that is similar in all of them is that they all move fairly quickly up until the last moments, the last hours of the life of Jesus. In fact, if this were a movie, all of the scenes would move pretty quickly until they get to the last week. And then things would slow down. And the director would give us more detail, more nuance. It's almost like the Gospels are introductions to the passages about his death and his resurrection. And in that last week, what we refer to as Holy Week, we started with a parade. It was his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but then soon things began to unravel quickly. And over the course of the next week, we would read some of the horrible atrocities that would happen, the betrayal, the torture, the eventual death of Jesus on a cross, which is the absolute worst way to die. And all of them told with great detail, with nuance. But we are here this morning because we know that that's not the end of the story, that there's more to it than that. That the last word does not belong to those that would inflict humiliation and pain, but instead, the last word belongs to God. So this morning, we'll be reading John's Gospel. We'll be reading John's account of what happens that first morning of the week when Mary arrives at the empty tomb. And we will hear in that the good news of the resurrection of Jesus.
The reading this morning is from John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Here begins the reading. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen's wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and she told him that he had said these things to her. The word of God for the people of God.
I think it's important for us to remember that on that first Easter, there was very little hope. That there was very little hope on that first Easter. In fact, did you hear how John begins the story? Early on the first day, while it was still dark. That's quite a phrase, isn't it? While it was still dark. You see, I would argue that John is not just telling the time, that he's creating for us an image. It was still dark. It was still dark with Peter's denial, with the betrayal of the disciples, his closest friends, his family. It was still dark with the apparent victory of the worst evil turned loose on the very best of us. It was still dark, John says. But then there's just a flicker of light. There's a flicker of light. Her name was Mary Magdalene, and she had been there on Friday at Calvary. And she stood at a distance, but even at a distance, she could see what was happening. She could hear the screams. And now she came close. She came close to care for Jesus' body. She came on that day to care for him in his death the way that he had cared for her in her life. So it's important for us to remember that she came that first morning out of duty, not out of hope. She wasn't going that morning expecting a resurrected Christ, but instead to prepare his body for burial. I mean, after all, nobody goes to a graveyard to look for the living. Now, there was a time when she dared to dream because of what Jesus brought, because of who Jesus was. But those days were over. No dreams, no left. The feet that had walked on water had been pierced. The hands that had healed the sick, that had lifted the fallen. The hands that had broken bread, that had healed wounded hearts, had been nailed to a cross. It was all over now. He was dead. And so was the dream. She came out of duty, not out of hope. Like John said, it was still dark. But how quickly things can change. When she arrives, the stone's been rolled away and the tomb, it appears, is empty. And so she runs to tell some of the disciples. And then they turn and run towards the tomb, just to see if what she was telling them was actually true. And sure enough, it's empty. All that was there were some burial clothes folded neatly. John tells us, did you pick this up? That the two disciples saw and believed, but they didn't understand. They couldn't quite yet understand. They saw and they believed, but they didn't understand. And then they left. And they went back home. I would argue that a lot of us are in that camp. That we believe something happened, even if we don't fully understand what or how. I would argue that a lot of us believe but don't fully understand. I'm that way some days. Marcus Borg was a New Testament professor, a brilliant biblical scholar. And he says that asking what happened on that first Easter, that's the wrong question. That's the wrong question to ask, that we can't really know. The gospel writers all tell the story slightly different. They don't explain. He says that the $100 question is not what happened, but rather, what does it mean? The $100 question is not what happened, but what does it mean? A few years ago, I asked my friends on social media, what's the meaning of Easter? Not what happened, but what does it mean? And I got a lot of responses, some from friends inside the church and some from friends outside the church. And I got a lot of strange responses too, as you can imagine. One person said, it means Jesus is on the loose. Hide the Easter eggs. Most people, though, spoke of newness, of new life, new beginnings. But the most common answer that I got was something along the lines of, Jesus died for my sins, was resurrected, overcame death and sin forever for everyone, and as a result of that, we all get to go to heaven someday. And friends, I would argue that while that may be true, I think Easter means something else, something different, something bigger. Not just after we die, but right now, today, tomorrow. When you go to school, when you go to work, when you have to deal with the people that you have to deal with on a regular basis. What does Easter mean then? What does Easter mean now? You see, I would argue that if Easter just means getting you out of hell and into heaven, then I think that we've missed a wider significance of not just what it meant back then in the time of Jesus, but what it means for you and me today. As Marcus Borg said, to reduce Easter to a spectacular miracle a long time ago and a hope for an afterlife is to diminish and to domesticate Easter. It's not about heaven, he said. It's about the transformation of this world. I know a dad who was at the Little League ballpark watching his son play ball. And in between innings, in the break in the action, he decided to make his way over to the snack shack to get a snow cone. And as he was walking back to the ballpark, back to his son's field, out of the corner of his eye on another field, he caught something that caught his attention. It was something quite extraordinary. And what he saw was number 8 up to bat. And number 8 swung and hit the pitch. And in that moment, everybody started yelling, "Run, run, run," which is a pretty clear indication that hitting the ball doesn't actually happen all that often to number 8. But number 8 ran as fast as he could, and just as he was getting close to first base, the throw came. And it was kind of a bang-bang play, but the ump called him safe. And everybody cheered. Now, many of you know, if you've ever been to a Little League baseball game, when there's a close play, only some of the folks in the stands cheer, while the rest of the people question the vision and the salvation of the umpire. But this time, everybody cheered. And there, standing on first base, was number 8, trying desperately to suppress an enormous smile. And friends, I would argue that if you've ever seen a young boy, 8, 9 years old, standing on first base, trying to suppress a smile, you know something about the goodness and the grace of God. Am I right? And you can see it now, can't you? In your mind's eye, you can see the boy, you can hear the crowd, and you can imagine that what occurred on that field of dreams was no ordinary hit. No, friends. This was the first hit. This was the first hit, and we can appreciate that, and we can smile right along with number 8. But to truly appreciate that hit, you had to be there. You had to be there week after week, game after game, strikeout after slow roller back to the mound to truly understand the significance of what had just happened. To truly appreciate the smile on that boy's face, you had to see it through the lens of his heartache, his tears, game after game. You had to be there week after week. And I would argue that in some ways, Easter is something like that. In order to understand the meaning, the significance of what happened on that first day of the week when Mary arrived at the tomb while it was still dark, you have to see it through the lens of everything that had led up to that moment. You have to see it through the lens of knowing that this man, that this Jesus had dedicated his life to bringing wholeness to people people with broken bodies, with broken spirits. He had healed people even on the Sabbath. That he had eaten with prostitutes and tax collectors, with sinners. He spoke with women right out in public. He welcomed children. He loved the little, the lost, the least. In other words, his life, his ministry was never just about getting people into heaven when they died. It was about making people whole in this life. I always find it interesting, and maybe you do too, that in the story, that when the disciples go to the tomb, and they look inside and they see that it's empty, they see the wrappings there, that they don't see the angels. They just turn and leave. It's only after they leave that Mary sees the angels after the other disciples have left, as she stood there weeping. It's as if her tears are kind of a lens through which she can see the angels. That her tears allow her to see them. In other words, Easter comes not just when the pain is over, when the pain is gone, but right in the middle of it. Easter is best glimpsed through tears, I would argue. Tom Long teaches preaching at a seminary in Atlanta. He's also written a beautiful book on funerals and eulogies called Accompany Them with Singing. And a few years ago, after he wrote that book, he was traveling to Valparaiso University to give a lecture on funerals and eulogies. And as he was flying, he was seated next to a man and his son, and they were quite clearly coming from Disney World because they were both wearing Donald Duck t-shirts and Mickey Mouse ears. And they were in a great mood, and they were super excited. The dad, was very gregarious and started up a conversation. And he asked, so where are you going? What are you doing? Why are you headed that way? And Tom was reluctant to tell him. You don't want to tell somebody in Mickey Mouse ears that you're going to give a lecture on death. But the man kept asking, and so finally he told him. And then this man gets quiet. And he said, back home at my mosque in Wisconsin, I have the honor, the privilege of washing the dead in our congregation. That when any of us in our congregation, in our mosque die, I get to be the one to care for their bodies, to prepare them for burial. And then he paused for a moment and he says, what I don't understand about Christians is that when it comes to funerals, is that you all leave before they're over. Long says that was a powerful observation, one that he thought about for a long time after that we leave before it's over. In other words, that we don't take them all the way to the place of farewell. We leave before they're over. When I heard that story, I thought of Peter. And I thought of the other disciple who left too soon, who didn't see the angels, who believed but didn't yet understand. And that reminded me of another story of another little boy back in the 1800s. He lived far out in the country, and even by the time he reached to be about the age of 12 years old, he had never in his whole life ever seen a circus. And so you can imagine his excitement when one day a poster appeared at his school that said next Saturday, the circus was coming to town, a traveling circus. And so that afternoon, after school, he ran home to see his dad. His feet barely touched the ground. He was so excited. And he said, Dad, you're not going to believe it. Can I go, please? Can I please go? His family didn't have a lot of money. But his dad sensed that this was pretty important to him. And so he said, I tell you what, if you do all of your chores ahead of time, come Saturday, you can go. Well, the following Saturday morning, the chores were done. He did them on Friday afternoon, and the little boy stood at the breakfast table in front of his dad, dressed in his Sunday best, and his father reached into the pocket of his overalls, and he pulled out a dollar bill. It was the most money that the little boy had ever held in his hand in his life. And the father told him to be careful and then sent him on his way. And he raced the whole way to the next town. And as he got close, he could see that people were lining the streets. And he worked his way through the crowd and pushed his way through the legs until he could see what was happening. And what he could see in the distance was the spectacle of the circus parade coming into town. And it was the coolest thing he had ever seen in his whole life. There were caged animals that growled and snarled at him as they passed by. The bands beat their drums and blew their shiny horns, and there were acrobats doing cartwheels while they swung ribbons above their heads. It was amazing. And then finally, after all of those folks had passed by where the little boy stood, along comes the clowns. One of them with floppy shoes, red nose, and a brightly colored face. And as the clown passed by, the little boy reached into his pocket and he pulled out the dollar and he gave it to him. And he turned and he walked home. You see, the little boy thought that he'd seen the circus, but he just saw the parade. He thought he had seen the circus, but he left. He'd only seen the parade. And last week, if you were here, we welcomed Jesus with a parade, and we waved palm branches, and we shouted Hosanna, and it was a great celebration. But what we know now is that that was not the best part of the story. And like the disciples, like the boy in the story, we shouldn't leave too soon. Because if we think that Easter is only about getting into heaven after we die, we are missing out on what it can mean for us now. And I would argue that we all long for resurrection in our lives in some way, shape, or form. Not someday after we die, but here, now. For some of us, we long for resurrection in our marriage. For some of us, it's a longing for resurrection in our relationship with our parents. For some, it's a longing for life after addiction or some knee-crippling betrayal. Some just want to live with the notion that tomorrow doesn't have to be like yesterday. Some just want to truly believe and trust that compassion still matters in this world, that God is alive and still at work. You see, I would argue that deep down, most of us aren't worried about the details of Jesus' resurrection, what happened. We're really interested in what it means for us. That we don't come to Easter to hear, to learn about a resurrection in the past, that we come to church on Easter with hopes, longing to experience resurrection here, now, today. You see, hope, at least in the Christian tradition, is about more than just wishful thinking. About thinking positively that things are going to turn out okay as long as we believe the right things, as long as we live the right way. Hope's different than that. Hope is different than optimism. It's different than certainty. Instead, hope is a story in which God is dropping an anchor in our lives way out in the future, and is just reeling us in, pulling us towards something beautiful, not just life after death, but life in this life. The promise that we will all be made whole. Hope is what allows us to trust that the beautiful things are still possible, that every breath we have is good, that there is possibility in each of them. You see, friends, that's hope. That's Easter. That's Easter. And so this time each year we gather with Mary at the door of an empty tomb and we look through our tears to acknowledge that the world's brokenness is finally not what is most real and what is most true. That Easter is not just about the past or even about what happens after we die. It's about here. It's about now. It's about the future that God is pulling us towards. It's about the promise from God that our best days are still ahead of us. That we are loved, each and every one of us. That we are loved as if we are the only ones on earth to be loved. That Easter matters here, now, today. Friends, Christ is risen.